During the First World War, the Royal Navy was on something of a steep learning curve when it came to dealing with enemy submarines. Having learned that hunting them in the open ocean with surface ships didn't really work too well, and that escorted convoys were better in that regard, they also realised that submarine versus submarine attacks were actually quite hard to pull off. Whilst various British submarines had attacked U-boats that they'd found on the surface, a consistent theme of reports was that if the British sub attempted to surface to engage in a gun duel, the U-boat could end up diving before the surfacing sub could bring its gun into play, and most detections would take place at a range that was too close for torpedoes to be easily brought to bear. Thus, in 1917, the Director of Naval Construction came up with an idea: a submarine specifically designed to hunt other submarines. Initially, the idea was rejected, but the officer in charge of the Royal Navy's submarine fleet was interested, and so design work would continue. This, combined with a proposal from the commander of the 5th Submarine Flotilla, merged into a concept that was remarkably far-sighted for the latter part of World War I. It called for a submarine capable of a very high underwater speed, with a separate smaller motor for slow-speed hunting, a total of 8 smaller 14-inch torpedo tubes up front capable of near-simultaneous fire, and a single 4-inch deck gun in a streamlined fairing. 2 additional torpedo tubes, one per side, would be fitted, and an all-around array of wide-spectrum hydrophones coupled with a directional hydrophone on the bow, and a towed array hydrophone, also directional, astern. The idea was for the sub to quietly hunt for enemy submarines using what we would today term passive sonar, then close in on the contact using the range and bearings triangulated from the various hydrophones, before suddenly making a sprint at the last minute and shotgunning a full spread of torpedoes at the target, the numbers making up for the lack of any homing torpedoes in World War I. If the enemy survived and surfaced, then the hunter would engage with its deck gun. To attain the target underwater speed of 14 to 15 knots, as well as the other performance characteristics, the design began to take shape in a manner that made no compromises. The hull shape resembled a spindle or teardrop, a form optimised for underwater travel that wouldn't reappear until the 1950s with USS Albacore. This meant that the hull aft was too narrow to have twin shafts, and in any case, shaft fairings increased drag, so the submarine was given a single central shaft, and a propeller that was equipped with a small 30 horsepower electric motor for slow speed work, and a pair of linked 600 horsepower electrical motors for the high speed dash. Within the small hull, only a 420 horsepower diesel could be fitted for surface running, which gave it a surface speed of around 9 knots, and this motor would also have to charge the massive 220 cell battery array, which would thus take about 6 hours to fully charge up. The spindle hull shape also meant the sub had relatively poor seakeeping on the surface, but this was considered an acceptable compromise in the hunt for underwater performance. The superstructure was minimised to reduce drag, with a bare minimum steering wheel and a platform for a pair of 4-inch deck guns, each of which would have a special watertight trunk for its 2-man crew adjacent, so that when the sub was due to surface, the gunners could seal themselves in the trunk coming up from the main hull, and could then emerge straight into action the moment the sub breached the surface. By this stage, the broadside tubes had been dropped as they would have imposed too much drag, and likewise the bow tubes had been dropped down to 6, but in the interests of greater destructive power and a faster build speed, they'd been upgraded to 18-inch, which the Royal Navy already had, as the 14-inch tubes would have needed a brand new tube design. It was also found that the sub was much more efficient when it cruised at a periscope depth of 16 foot, which was much deeper than most submarines went for their periscope depth patrolling. And because periscopes of the time that were much longer than 8 foot tended to vibrate a lot, a slim fairwater structure was installed above the conning tower in order to prevent the vibrations. A fairing was also put in place on the bow to try and help somewhat with seakeeping and steerage. To make the sub more agile, a pair of folding hydroplanes amidships, as well as the normal pairs fore and aft, was fitted, and a total of 12 torpedoes would be carried, 6 in the tubes, along with 1 reload per tube. So eager was the Royal Navy to get the submarines into service that a number of H-class submarines were cancelled and various L-class were delayed. The towed array also appears to have been dropped, as was the deck armament. Laid down in 1917, the class was all in the water the following year, with a number actually managing to commission before the end of the war. 12 had been ordered in total, but R5 and R6 would be cancelled at the end of the war. One submarine managed to successfully track and hunt a U-boat. This was HMS R7, achieving a successful firing position at a depth of 60 feet after a completely undetected approach. However, depending on which account you believe, the U-boat either turned at the last minute to evade a steamer, and thus the salvo of torpedoes missed, or else one of the torpedoes did actually hit, whether or not the U-boat turned, but failed to explode. Although incredibly advanced for their time, and incorporating a mission and hull profile that wouldn't be seen again until the Cold War, the R-class were largely scrapped in 1923 as a cost-saving measure. R4 and R10 were kept as training subs, and they generally did incredibly well in this role, but still there would be no successors to them when they too were sold out of service in 1929 for R10 and 1934 for R4.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.